Tamari, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us for this dam safety webinar this morning. My name's Susanna Tallman and I'm the Manager of Building Policy and Building Systems Performance at MBIE. And I wanted to welcome you all to this webinar this morning and thank you for joining us. Just before I get underway, I wanted to acknowledge that many of you may be in areas which have been suffering from some substantial rainfall and weather events over the last 48 hours and in an ongoing basis. And just wanted to reassure you that if you have to duck away to take care of stock or any flooding issues around your property, that the recording of this webinar will be available on our website at a later date. And all of the information that we present today is also available on that website. Of course, I think this will be a really interesting and engaging webinar, and I'm looking forward to you listening in and joining us and learning as we go through the day. But if you need to duck off, then that is totally fine. The information will be available at a later date. So as I mentioned, we're here today to talk about the building dam safety regulations, which come into force on the 13th of May. I wanted to welcome Tim Farrant. He's one of our presenters here today. Tim, do you want to say hello?
Thank you, Sue. So my name's Tim Farrant. I'm the Building Engineering Manager in Building System Performance, and I am a resident dam engineer.
Thanks, Tim. And to Connor Top-Annan, who will also be presenting today.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Connor Top-Annan. I work as a Senior Advisor within MBIE's Building System Performance branch, working on the implementation side of these regulations.
Fantastic. Thanks so much to you both, and we'll be hearing them from them throughout this morning. So just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what the webinar will cover today. So we're going to go over some of the key points for the things that you need to be aware of for the dam safety regulations. In particular, we'll also cover why is the government implementing dam safety regulations right now, how to comply, so which dams are impacted, and what are those really key timeframes that you need to be aware of. We'll point you to where you can find information and resources so that you can continue to find that information after the webinar today. We'll talk a bit about what happens if there is non-compliance, and then we'll leave some time at the end for some questions and answers. So just a reminder that you can ask questions. If you think of questions throughout the day or throughout this hour-long webinar, if you can put them into the Q&A function, please, that will allow us to address those questions in a structured way at the end. So with that in mind, we'll move forward to talk about what we're going to cover here today. I'll just see if here we go. So a couple of key points I already mentioned. The dam safety regulations come into force on the 13th of May 2024. And the impacted dams are those that have a height of 4 or more meters and store 20,000 or more cubic meters of volume of water or other fluid. Now, that is a recent change. Some of you may be aware that the Minister for Building and Construction announced a change to the thresholds just a couple of weeks ago. And so we'll talk a little bit more on a future slide about what that looks like. However, the key thing to take away is this threshold is the same as what it is for a building consent application. So it applies to dams of 4 or more meters in height, and stores 20,000 or more cubic meters of volume of water or other fluid. So the other key thing that you need to be aware of is that if your dam reaches that threshold, then you'll need to submit a potential impact classification to your regional authority by the 13th of August 2024. So that's 3 months after the dam safety regulations come into force. So all of this information is available on our building performance website, which is at building.govt.nz. So feel free to look and find those resources there for more information. Okay, so from here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the change that government has made to these dam safety regulations, if my keys are working properly. So I guess the key thing to note here is that across recent history or history in New Zealand, there have been several significant dam failures in Aotearoa New Zealand's history. Since 1960 specifically, there have been 25 dam incidents, with at least 14 that could be considered serious. So some examples of those dam failures, some farm dams were compromised in the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016, which required some drainage of some structures in the Seddon district under emergency orders. And in June 2023, a soil dam administered by the Waipa District Council on the edge of Hamilton burst, sending 23,000 cubic metres of water through 20 homes in the suburb of Glenview in the city's south. I guess the key to note is the cost of a typical dam failure in New Zealand is estimated at $5.8 million or thereabouts. And until now, New Zealand has had a scheme, has lacked a scheme for assessing and monitoring the safety of dams in New Zealand. So these regulations bring New Zealand into line with most other OECD countries, which have a system, a nationally consistent system for monitoring the safety of dams. So the decision was made, as I said, to lift that threshold to 4 metres a couple of weeks ago. From here, I'm going to invite Connor to talk a little bit more about how you can comply with these regulations.
Awesome, thanks, Suze. So yeah, I'll take us through some key steps I think you should sort of work through to comply with these regulations, and also cover off the key timeframes. The images you're going to see in the following slides are from a poster we've got on our website, and it provides a bit of an overview of the key steps in a nice visual way. So as you can see here, this is one of the visuals. So step one is to figure out if the structure you have meets the Building Act's definition of a dam. So the Building Act defines a dam as an artificial barrier, and it's a pertinent structures that is constructed to hold back water or other fluid under a constant pressure, so as to form a reservoir. And so, for example, it could be used for the storage, control, or diversion of water or other fluid. So structures include, a flood control dam, a natural feature that's been significantly modified to function as a dam, so it's intended to function that way, and also a canal. Importantly, sort of what doesn't this include? Well, the Building Act states that it doesn't include a stop bank, which is designed to control floodwaters. So that's step one. So if your structure doesn't meet this definition, then it's not impacted by these regulations. So that's the key thing to know from the get-go. If it does, then you need to move on to step two. Oh, what's happened there? Cool, thank you. So step two, you have a dam, it meets that definition, but the next thing is to figure out whether it's large enough to be impacted by these regulations. So a pretty key question, which I'm sure a few of us are here to sort of learn about. So as Suze mentioned, if your dam has a height of 4 or more meters and stores 20,000 or more cubic meters volume of water or other fluid, then it is impacted by these regulations. Dams are impacted by the regulations are known as what's called like a classifiable dam. So you might hear that term a little bit. And as Suze mentioned earlier, the threshold is the same for as a building consent. So this means if your dam was built today and it needed a building consent, it would also need to comply with these regulations after it was built. These regs focus on the post-construction safety of dams. Just to clarify, that's not to say that just because you don't have a building consent, say the dam was built pre-2004, that you don't need to comply with these regulations. It's more that we're just highlighting the height and volume thresholds because the building consent thresholds are quite well known within the industry. Cool. So we know what the height and volume thresholds are, but how do we actually measure this? And importantly, where do we measure from? Well, how you measure the height of your dam is set in the Building Act. It does vary slightly depending on the type of dam. For example, if it's a dam across a stream versus not across a stream, and also for canals. But broadly, the height of a dam is the vertical distance from the crest of the dam, so the top, to the lowest elevation at the outside limit of the dam. So that diagram there illustrates that. Importantly, a key question we get is, does it include water below ground level? No. So any water retained below the natural ground level at the lowest downstream outside limit of the dam is not measured. The rationale behind that is if the dam was to fail, then theoretically that water wouldn't go anywhere. I've included another illustration. I think it's easier than sort of listening and some jargon there. So this one shows the water level in blue and light blue, as well as the theoretical maximum water level. So that's illustrated in brown. The key thing here is that we're focusing on an overtopping failure for these regulations, and we're predicting breach flows based on that. So how much water would be released, where would it go, sort of what would that effect be? And that's why we're measuring from the crest of the dam. Acknowledge there's a little bit of jargon there, but we've developed a resource to help you measure the height and the volume of your dam. The easiest way to do it really is using existing information. So if you have construction drawings or a building consent, hoping that that information is there. So that's probably the first point of call. If you don't have that information on hand already, we've worked with Irrigation New Zealand and some engineers to develop a resource to help dam owners, sort of a farmer focus, quickly and cheaply determine if your dam meets the height and volume thresholds. Alternatively, if you don't want to take on that work yourself, you can engage a surveyor or a technical practitioner like an engineer for support. Tim will talk a little bit more about where to find those people in further slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Connor. Just a quick clarification question. So dams that were built before 2004, so didn't need a building consent, but if they have got sort of that height above 4 meters and more than 20,000 cubic meters, are they classifiable dams?
Yes. So if they meet the definition and if they meet that height and volume threshold, then yes, they're impacted, regardless of whether they have a building consent.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. And I also just want to check this, what we're seeing on the screen now, this resource for dam owners, looks like it's a really useful document. Where can people find that information?
So that's on our website. If you, someone will hopefully chuck a link in the chat function. But yeah, if you have a look on the resources page, you'll find that resource along with other ones to support you. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Connor. I wanted to take a little bit of time now just to talk about, I guess, why the classifiable dams threshold has changed recently. So the government received quite a lot of feedback, both since the change of government and prior, around the number of dams and the resource available from recognised engineers to support the classification of dams. And so the government's listened to that feedback and decided to make a change to the size of the dams which are impacted by those regulations. And that has resulted in around 1,900 fewer dams being needing to comply with the regulation. So this leaves around 1,100 based on the limited information we have that are still in scope. So the changes or where we've landed in terms of this threshold, we wanted to make sure that the thresholds were proportionate to the risks that smaller dams pose, and also taking into account, I guess, the cost of undertaking a potential impact classification and making sure that those costs were proportional to the risks that we're trying to manage. In particular, we also want to make sure that the engineering resource that we need to use for this is focused on the dams with the greatest risk, and that we're focusing on physical risk reduction from those dams. And that's because dam owners need to be able to have the resources available to meet their responsibilities. And we know that there was some concern about the number of recognised engineers. So just a note, the regulations on the New Zealand legislation website still currently include the old thresholds. That's because even though the government has decided to make the change and has announced the change, we're still working through the process of amending those regulations. The timing is to be confirmed, but the key takeaway is that as a dam owner, you should be looking at the new revised thresholds, which are on our website, rather than the old ones and regulations themselves. And we'll be actively communicating when those changes to regulations are made, and they'll also be notified through formal communications. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Tim Farrant. I nearly mixed up your names, you guys, who's going to talk us through a little bit more of the next steps. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Suze. Cool. So I'm going to talk about steps 3 to 7, which is the next bit you need to do after you've identified if your dam is affected by the dam safety regulations. Sorry, there we go. So I'm just having it. Right, there we go. That's my slide. So potential impact classification, what is it? So it's an assessment of the potential impacts downstream of a theoretical dam failure on community, historical, cultural places, critical or major infrastructure, and the natural environment. Is a site visit required? No. A site visit is not required under these regulations. However, that being said, a technical practitioner might ask you, the dam owner, to provide some information, for example, site photographs or site measurements. As Connor presented earlier, we've got some resources available on our website to help you gather information on your dam to help a practitioner prepare a potential impact assessment. Why do PICs matter? So potential impact classifications are triaged as low, medium or high potential impact dams. And that determines whether you need to complete a dam safety assurance program. A dam safety assurance program is required for medium and high PIC dams. However, it is not required under the regulations for low impact dams. This is the design of the regulations to prioritise the additional work on the medium and the high impact dams. Now, a note on who can do an assessment. The regulation provides for anyone to complete a potential impact classification assessment. However, it must be audited and certified by a recognised engineer for PIC. Once it's certified, it's the dam owners responsible to submit it to the regional authority. Dam owners may choose to engage a recognised engineer or a firm to complete both the potential impact assessment and to get it certified. Now cover when it's due. So Form 1, so that's the PIC form on the regulations, is due to the regional authority by the 13th of August 2024, or 3 months after a dam is commissioned. So 3 months after the regulations commence or 3 months after it's commissioned. And we're working with the regional authorities and they will provide the forms available on the websites, or if not, we've got copies on the Building Performance website as well. You can find them on building.gov.nz. Suze, did you want to ask me a question?
I'm always keen to ask you a question, Tim. So a couple of things. How much will a potential impact classification cost?
Thanks, Suze. It will depend on the scope of the engagement between the engineer and their client. That being said, we've published an impact assessment and based on the information we had at the time, we estimated in the order of 3,000 to 7,000, depending on the scope of that engagement. We've received some reports that there are some consultants providing a service within about that range, and some are a wee bit higher depending on the dam and the scope of engagement that they've been asked to do.
Cool, thank you. I've got another question, but I'm going to save it for the end of your section, I think. So I'll let you continue on, and then I'll come back to you.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. So the next part of step 3. So this potential impact classification assessment, I've covered a bit of this already, so I'll just briefly cover this again. It's due to the regional authority by the 13th of August, or 3 months after the dam's commissioned. But you can complete them now before the regulations come into effect. You just need to submit them from the 13th of May through to the 13th of August. The role of the recognised engineer. Now, as I mentioned before, the role of the recognised engineer is to audit and certify the potential impact classification assessment. They're not required to carry out the potential impact classification assessment themselves, although a firm may provide that service as both completing it and having it audited and certified. And it is Engineering New Zealand who's responsible for assessing and registering the recognised engineers.
Okay, Tim, I think it's time for my other question here.
Okay.
Do you think there are enough engineers for this work?
The availability of technical resource was a key consideration by the government on revising the thresholds. So reducing the number of dams that require assessment will mean that there's frees up resource to undertake more assessments and also to get on with the dam safety assurance work, which is the end goal of these regulations. So yeah, freeing them up to help classifiable dam owners meet their obligations on time. It should be noted that recognised engineers will also have a team supporting them. So the currently there's 18 recognised engineers registered with Engineering New Zealand, and we understand that each one has about sort of 5 or 10 typically engineers working with them. So a firm may distribute the work across their employees.
Thanks for that, Tim.
Cool. I'll now move forward to the Dam Safety Assurance Program, which is step 4. And as I mentioned before, this is required for dam owners who have medium or high potential impact dams. So what is it and why is it needed? So a Dam Safety Assurance Program provides dam owners with a structured framework of plans and procedures that need to be carried out to ensure that dam is safely operated and maintained. It needs to be audited and certified by a recognised engineer, and then sent to your regional authority for filing. Just a note here, as I mentioned before, dams with a low potential impact classification assessment don't require a dam safety assurance program to be completed under these regulations. Recognised engineers will audit and certify these. It's anyone can complete the DSAT, but it's likely that you'll require some support from someone with experience in dam safety. It could be an engineer, but it doesn't have to be a recognised engineer, or it might be a different engineer within that firm that prepares the assessment that has it signed off by RecEng. Once it's certified, the dam owners are responsible for submitting it to the regional authority. Just recapping when it's due, medium PIC dams are due no later than 2 years after the regional authority approves the PIC assessment. And for a high PIC dam, the DSAT form must be submitted no later than 12 months after the regional authority approves the PIC. Our guide to complying with the dam safety regulations provides more information on what a DSAP is and what it should contain. So the next step is preparing an annual dam compliance certificate. And this is a certificate which shows to the regional authority that the procedures in the DSAP have been complied with over the last 12 months, or any minor items of non-compliance are noted. So these are signed off again by a recognised engineer, but they reflect the work that has been completed by the dam owner over the course of that year. As before, they're not required for low potential impact classification dams, but they are required for medium and high PIC dams on the anniversary of the DSAP approval. The next step is to review the potential impact classification And this applies to all dams. Low, medium, and high PIC dams that are classifiable dams need to have their PIC classification reviewed. So this is repeating that step 3. So engaging a technical practitioner or someone similar to review your PIC and then prepare, get it re-audited and resurveyed, recertified, just to confirm whether there's been any changes since the potential impact classification was first done. So when is it needed? So dam owners must review the dam safety, the potential impact classification assessment within 5 years of the regional authority first approving it. After the first review, it must be done at intervals of no more than 5 years. Step 7, reviewing the Dam Safety Assurance Program. So the Dam Safety Assurance Program must be reviewed to make sure it's all appropriate, and whether there's been updates or changes over the past several years need to be reflected in their plans. When's it due? So for medium PIC dams, must be reviewed on the 10-year anniversary of the Dam Safety Assurance Plan being approved, and at intervals of no more than 7 years thereafter. And for high PIC dams, they must be reviewed on the anniversary of 5 years of the regional authority approving it, and then after that first review of not more than 5 years. I'm now going to pass on to Connor, who's going to talk more about some information and resources we have available to support us.
Oh, one too far. There we go. Awesome. Thank you, Tim. So yeah, I just guess one would not acknowledge there's quite a bit of information we've just covered, steps 1 through 7, but all of that is available on the website. A key thing is it's not all needed straight away. The sort of key bits to focus on right now are steps 1 to 3. So, you know, do you have a dam? Does it meet the thresholds? And then looking at that first step of a potential impact classification. I've provided a slide up here just around some of the resources and information we've got available on the website. So someone will chuck a link in the chat, and then, yeah, really recommend having a look at these. On the website, you'll find a resource to help you determine the height and volume of your dam. So I talked a little bit about that earlier. You'll also find the 3 forms that you'll need to send to the, potentially need to send to the regional authority or your council. Also, the council's website should have forms available as well. And if they don't, then they will do by the 13th of May. We've also included a short video. It really sort of just summarizes. It's a bit of a promo thing. But yeah, check that out on the website as an online learning module. And then pretty key to this is a guide to complying with the dam safety regulations. So that's a guidance document that goes into a lot more depth. So we've really tried to cover off from a video sort of e-learning module all the way through to detailed guidance for people. Just trying to get to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Cool. It's a little bit laggy. I thought I'd just include this up as well. So this is what the website itself looks like. In addition to the resources I mentioned, the website itself has quite a lot of information that we've covered today. And just the sort of last section we'll talk through is, you know, what happens if a dam owner doesn't comply with the regulations? It's quite laggy. Here we go. So just for a little bit of context, MBIE, who we work for, provide the overall leadership for the building sector as a central regulator and is leading the overall implementation of these regulations. And then we've got regional authorities who we're working with really closely, and their role is to administer and monitor the implementation / enforcement of both the Building Acts, but also the regulations. At MBIE, we're working closely with the regional authorities and encouraging them to take an educational approach to enforcement in that first instance. The focus really is to ensure that dams are well maintained and kept safe, sort of keeping that at the core. However, in saying that, the Building Act does have fines and penalties for dam owners who, for whatever reason, aren't complying. For example, up to a $50,000 fine for an individual, and up to $150,000 for a body corporate for not submitting either a potential impact classification or a dam safety assurance plan. Yeah, so if you want more information about that, you can have a look at MBIE's Guide to Complying with the Regulations, section 10 specifically, so it's kind of down towards the bottom. Yeah, hand over to Suze.
Thanks so much for that, Connor. What I'm going to do now is just kind of reiterate, I guess, what the key takeaways from today's webinar so far have been, and then we'll jump into some of the Q&A section. So it's now my turn to battle with the slides for a slide. There we go. So a couple of key takeaways. So if you take just a couple of things away from the webinar today, let it be that the dam safety regulations come into force on the 13th of May, 2024. That's just over a month away. And that the impacted dams, so following the recent change, are those that have a height of 4 or more metres and store 20,000 or more cubic metres volume of water or other fluid. The other key takeaway that I would take is that all of the information you need to understand what your obligations are available through our website, building.govt.nz. There are 7 key steps in understanding how these would apply to you. So the first one is to determine if you have a dam based on the definition of a dam in the Building Act. The next thing to do is to determine if your dam is impacted by the regulations, and that's where the calculation of the height and the volume of water comes into play. Then determine and send the potential impact classification to your regional authority by the 13th of August 2024. And then if you have a medium or high impact dam, to prepare a dam safety assurance program, and then to prepare an annual compliance certificate for those as well. And then for all dams, you'll need to review the potential impact classification, and finally review the dam safety assurance program for those that are medium and high impact dams on the regular basis. But the 3 key things today: determine if you have a dam, determine if your dam is impacted by the regulations, and determine and send the potential impact classification to your regional authority by the date of 13th of August 2024. And just a reminder to visit building.govt.nz for more information and resources. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, I can see that we've had some questions coming in thick and fast, so thank you so much for those. I'm going to get Connor and Tim to turn their videos back on, and David in the background, I might get you to turn off the presentation. So I'm going to start with a question of my own, if I can. So Connor, you kind of mentioned that it's MBIE that provides the information, but that it's the regional councils that need to follow the next steps. Mm-hmm. So how should regional council compliance officers prepare for these changes?
Yeah, really good question. So we had some ones come through before, so we'll try to cover those. I guess in the first instance, just become familiar with the regulations, but the website itself, it's a little more layman's terms, can kind of have a look at that. I guess if the question is asking about dangerous dams and how they're managed, then your council should have a dangerous dams policy, or be currently developing one. The who and the who does the what, the who does what, and which team they're in. That'll vary a bit depending on each council. So whether it's within your sort of regulatory team or compliance. So I just suggest discussing that internally with them. If this question's come from a regional authority, get in touch with us here. we've set up a bit of a network with regional authorities, so can definitely help out.
Awesome, thank you. And before I get into those questions, I've got another one for you. So some people may be aware that MBIE's been working on a PIC assessment tool. Can you give us a little bit of an update on where that's at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're working with Irrigation New Zealand and some recognised engineers to develop. It's been split into two now. We've got a checklist for dam owners, as well as a PIC screening tool. So we're aiming to have that checklist ready before the regulations come into force, and then the screening tool soon thereafter. So the idea is, the checklist, a dam owner can pick that up, have a look at, what information would be useful to contribute to a PIC, and work their way through gathering that information. So really trying to make it as easy as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. So I think the first question from the chat is probably one for you as well. Is the volume calculated, is it calculated only using the water that sits above the ground or overflow? I think people there are talking about the volume of the water, not just the height.
Yeah, I'd really recommend having a look at that, the resource we've linked in the chat. It does provide some sort of lookup tables and calculations for circular dams, rectangular, canals as well are covered in there. But yes, and we're just focused on the water stored above ground level. But yeah, really recommend having a look at that resource and sort of thinking about your dam in particular. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Connor. I'm going to let you off the hook for the next question, and I'm going to fire this one Tim's way. So Thomas Fritz had a question. Risk is the combination of hazard times likeliness of the risk occurring. How is excluding some of those dams that have no dam safety systems in place and owners who have no idea about dam safety, and therefore there's a higher likeliness of the risk occurring? How is that making New Zealand safer?
Thanks, Suze. Not an easy one to start with.
No, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's
Great
fine.
question, though.
Yeah, Thomas, look, I want to acknowledge your comments there on risk. So the focus here is very much on dams that have a greater consequence. When we are talking about risk, we are talking about larger dams that by definition will have a larger predicted breach flow, and so therefore have a larger impact typically downstream. So the prioritisation the Minister has considered here is that focusing on the largest dams that present that greatest consequence risk downstream. This is a similar principle that's been applied in the building consent threshold, for example, that's been around for 20 years. So yeah, there's an element of accepting some risk, and so this change in the threshold does accept more risk, but it's a similar approach to what has been done for building consenting for some time.
Thanks, Tim. I'm also just curious, what other tools are there for managing some of the, some dangerous dams?
Yeah. So this doesn't change the council's responsibility to have a dangerous dams policy, as kind of talked about, and to take action on dams, regardless of their size, if they are identified as being dangerous dams.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate that. Connor, this next one I'm going to throw to you first, but if you need me to step in too, I'm happy to do that. So Andrew Baum asked, can you provide some insight on the range of feedback that we received on the targeted consultation on the change to the classifiable dam threshold? So what did we hear from not just the owners of small dams, but from other stakeholders and owners?
Mm-hmm. Really good question. The consultation was targeted, and that it wasn't fully open. It was sort of those involved in the development of the regulations themselves. So I guess based on, the consultation provided options to sort of amend the regulations based on that feedback. I got to say, feedback was a little bit mixed, as you'd expect from different audiences. But yeah, the government sort of weighed up those options and decided that the new height and volume thresholds, from their perspective, strikes the right balance between sort of societal expectations for managing potential risks with the cost of compliance. So we have to set the level somewhere, and it's always about striking that balance.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. I think the only thing I would add to that is that we did have a range of feedback that said don't make any changes through to going further than the changes that we've made. So up to 8 meters, for example, in much larger volumes of water. So this was where government decided the right balance was struck. So Joe Francis has a question. Section 133B of the Building Act, I love it when people quote the different sections of the Building Act to me, states that subpart 7 only applies to classifiable and referable dams. So this is talking about the definition of referable dams. Do either of you want to have a go at answering how we treat referable dams at the moment? I guess the short is there isn't currently a definition, but through further policy analysis and development, we may choose to develop a definition for a referable dam in the future. That's something that we are still working through with the Minister of Building and Construction. And one of the things may be working through how these, is a review of how these regulations have gone once they've come into force. We'll be able to take that into account in terms of how we may progress that. Anything to add from the experts on the call? Great. So Eli talked about, I think you've kind of already answered this. So some smaller dams without engineering input could present a higher risk than a very large dam with appropriate engineering oversight. So have we, taking into account a risk framework or talked about consequences? And I think, Tim, you already referred to, we do talk about consequence, but do you have anything further to add here?
I do want to acknowledge this point that Eli's made, and I see that Leah King's actually also asked a similar question further down about a dam that's less than 4 meters high and less than 20,000 cubic meters that could also be a high-pick dam. So that's acknowledged that there are going to be some medium and high-pick dams that will be excluded by this higher threshold, and so there's a cost reduction of not needing to undertake picks for those 1900 dams, but there is an accepting of risk that some of those medium and high pick dams will be excluded. It's not to say that we don't encourage owners to go and proactively manage their assets well, and so those medium and high pick dams aren't required under the regulations to undertake activities, but they, for various other reasons, including their own management of their asset and meeting their health and safety at work Act requirements, might undertake potentially a similar amount of work, but they're not required to under this regulation.
Thanks, Tim. I think that's a really good answer. Connor, is this only new dams?
No, it's existing dams as well.
Yeah, so in those, as we said before, also those that were built before 2004 and may not currently have a building consent. Awesome. And just to confirm, Jeremy, I think I can even take this one. If your dam is below 4 meters in height, then it's non-classifiable and no pick is required. That's correct. Yeah, that's right. Just catching up. Terry, I'm not sure, were you, maybe you'd like to put in another point here. Were you asking where some of the resources are? I'm not entirely sure where your comments from. So if you can clarify that, we can come back to your question. Tim, Stephen McNally's got some really cool questions for you. So in parallel, some district and regional councils are currently reviewing their dangerous, flood-prone and earthquake-prone dam policies. Does a PIC conducted under the dam safety regulations on its own actually assess flood-prone or earthquake-prone status of a structure, given a PIC only looks at uncontrolled discharge scenario and not the nature of the dam or spillway construction itself?
Thanks, Suze. Yeah, that's quite a well considered question, Stephen. So thank you. Many on the call will be aware here, but I'll repeat it: is that the potential impact classification only deals with the consequence downstream. It doesn't consider likelihood of that failure having occurred. So looking at flood and earthquake performance isn't something that's done as part of that PIC assessment. It's something that may be identified, but not necessarily. And so it's really that dam safety assurance program work that will identify when a dam is flood or earthquake prone. That being said, the regulations in the Act do require a recognised engineer to refer a dam to the regional authority if they identify in the course of their engagement that a dam is flood or earthquake prone. But you may not identify that at the time of the pick.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Tim. And just a follow up from Stephen, and this may actually be, you said you want to answer it, so you can take it. Can you clarify the need or not for recertification of low pick at the 5-year anniversary?
Yes, so the regulations call for all classifiable dams to be recertified at that 5-year anniversary of the pick. So that includes low pick dams.
Awesome, thank you. All right, you can take a break now. I'll bring Connor back. So Bill Veal has a question for you. What is MBIE's recommended process to rescind dam classification certificates, Form 1, if they've already been signed for recognised dams, recognised engineers for dams with heights less than 4 metres, particularly if they've been issued to a dam owner and potentially already sent to a regional authority?
Yeah, really good question, Bill. So yeah, some dam owners may be well on their way to meeting the regulations, and that, you know, with this threshold change, it might mean that the dam is no longer impacted. From MBIE's perspective, it's not wasted effort. I think regardless of the size of the dam, you know, we encourage owners to understand the potential impact if their dam was to fail, and have dam safety plans, for example, in place to safeguard around sort of surrounding, sort of safeguard against that disproportional risk. So yeah, the councils are aware of the threshold change. So if you've already submitted your dam's pick to the council, then I'd recommend just getting in touch with them and just clarifying that the dam is no longer impacted by the regulations.
Thanks, Connor. Firstly, can I say that's really great to hear people have progressed their pick, impact their classifications and done that work. And I think there's still a benefit from understanding if your dam has a what the pick classification of your dam is. Reasonably technical question. I suspect the answer is in that resource you've shared, Connor. But if the embankment crest height varies, so if it's not sort of all at one level, where do you measure from? Is it from the highest crest level or the lowest crest level?
Tim backed me up on this, but I think it just would be the highest point. What?
Yeah. I guess a dam, when we talk about a dam, could be one that is a reservoir formed by many dams. And so, for example, if you had a reservoir that was that had a saddle dam plus a main dam, for example, you may have different pick classifications for each of those two dams. So that would be an example of where you have different height dams that form a reservoir. If you had one dam that had a varying crest level, you could, in theory, segregate out parts of it as different assessments. So yes, a reservoir can be formed by multiple dams and could, in theory, have multiple pick assessments.
Oh, thank you. Thomas has another question on if we're excluding some clear high pick structures, such as the Lake Taupo outlet structure or various urban stormwater detention dams with the change in threshold, how can New Zealand be assured that the risks associated with those structures will be managed appropriately, given they are now not covered by dam safety regulations? Tim, do you want to have a go at that?
Yes, yeah. I'm just not 100% sure what the question was in that, but I guess what I would note is that there are some requirements existing and some resource consents for some of those smaller dams. So I'm not familiar with the Taupo outlet structure, but it may have certain conditions, for example, on its use. I think it's a little bit more case by case, Thomas, so I probably can't talk in detail on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are also responsible business owner health and safety obligations, etc., that may come into account there as well. So Tim, for you this one as well, John Rillstone has a question around the process of having your PIC certified by a recognised engineer. He's asking, is he right in saying that this audit process does not require an on-site visit from the recognised engineer and can be done with a desktop review?
So that's a clarification, is the recognised engineer's role is specifically to audit and to certify the PIC assessment. It's not their role defined under the regulations is needing to complete the PIC assessment. So the potential impact classification could be done by the owner themselves if they have the skills, or another technical practitioner. Now, whether a site visit is required is a little bit case by case for that technical practitioner, but in many cases we expect that existing information would be able to be used, and possibly with some site measurements and photos, etc., from the owner. So it's really about the owners providing that information to a technical practitioner to complete the PIC assessment with enough detail for confidence that the recognised engineer can sign off.
Thank you, Tim. Connor, one for you. What will the MB screening tool provide as an output? Do you know the answer to that yet?
Yeah, so it's still under development, but the idea is that using the checklist, a dam owner will gather information about the height, volume, but also about the downstream effects if the dam was to fail. So is there a school downstream, for example? And then they would then use this triaging tool, kind of, let's say like a process map of sorts, to work their way through to give them an indication about whether the dam would be a low, medium, or high PIC, and sort of, if it's very clearly that it would be low, that's great. But if you need more information to determine the classification, then it would indicate that as well. But yeah, still under development at this stage.
Cool, thank you. And what do you mean in dam definitions about natural features that are modified to act as a dam?
So, for example, if you had a stream or a river that you've dammed off, but in terms of what's it called? Sorry, Tim, back me up on this. Like a natural sort of an earth dam, for example. So sort of commonly seen on farms, for example. So you've dammed off a stream to form a reservoir, and then using that for irrigation, for example. So that's pulling from the definition in the Building Act.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to answer a question from Mark Broughton right now, who thought a different approach to completely ruling out dams of lower thresholds will be allow those lower dams to be assessed at a later date rather than by August 13th. That was one of the options that we considered in some early advice. That would have meant that we would have had to make changes to legislation, which takes years. And we think that having a dam safety program, nationally consistent dam safety regulations that come into force now that allow us to start managing the physical risk from dams is important. So we did take that into consideration, and the change to the height threshold was one thing that we could do and still have these come into force on the 13th of May, and we think that that is a good compromise. I'm going to now address Terry Hewitt's question, or ask somebody else to address that. Can large dams be divided into cells, e.g. walls or partitions that are less than 20,000 litres? If we need to take some of these offline, then we can, Tim.
I can answer that. Yeah, I guess one example would be like a wastewater treatment plant where you have multiple smaller dams, and you might have potentially an intermediate dam between different parts of that. So if that, for example, that the compartments in that wastewater treatment plant had less than 20,000 cubic meters, I assume you mean cubic meters, then you would end up downgrading those to be below that low classification threshold. So you wouldn't be required to submit a PIC for those if the cells themselves were less than 20,000 cubic meters. Yeah, I'm just thinking a treatment plant which had about sort of 7 or 8 that were around that number.
Thank you, Tim. That's something I've learned today. I think I'm going to ask one more question from the list, and then I'll wrap up because there's a few final messages I wanted to get across. So Shreesh has asked, how does MB determine if an inadvertent dam will be part of the regulations? So if the primary purpose of the structure was not designed and built to be a dam? Connor, do you have a view?
Yeah, we've had this question from regional authorities a fair bit. So sort of the position we've come to is really, if it hasn't been designed to function as a dam, then it's not covered by these regulations. So we really have to go back to the definition of a dam in the Building Act. Yeah, so
yeah, so I think what we're saying is ultimately the definition of a dam in the Building Act is kind of the primary thing that you can come back to. And if you make the test against that, and you meet that test and that definition, then once you've gone through the threshold calculation, you'll know whether you're in scope or not. I am going to give you one more, Connor. So Paul Kirby has asked, if dams are low risk under the new regulation, so no PIC required, but may be dangerous, are these expected to be covered by regional authority dangerous dam policy?
Yeah, that's a good question, Paul. So yeah, the regulations, well, dangerous dams, the policies only apply to, the definition of a dangerous dam in the Building Act is that it has to be a medium or a high potential impact dam, and there are a couple of other things in there as well. But if you read through one of the policies from the regional authorities, there are sections in the Building Act around measures to avoid immediate danger, and that applies to all dams. So even if it was a low PIC dam, the policy could cover that. Even if it wasn't a classifiable dam, so impacted by these regulations, those sections apply to those dams. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Connor. So I did want to acknowledge that there are still a lot of questions in the chat. That's really exciting. Sometimes I do a webinar and there are no questions. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your questions today, and we'll undertake to get back to as many of those as we can. So I did just want to thank everybody now for joining us today and listening into the webinar. It's great to see so many of you on the call. When you leave the webinar today, there will be I think there's a survey today, and then be on the lookout as well for a survey for dam owners as a whole that we'll send out soon, which is partially targeted at understanding how ready you are for those regulations to come into force. So I wanted to thank Connor and Tim for your contributions today, and thank you all for joining us, and wish you all a very good day. Thank you so much for joining us. Kia pai tō rā.